Hello, friends of the European spirit. Today, I'd like to introduce to you Karl Philipp Moritz's Götterlehre, the teaching of the gods oder mythologische Dichtungen, der alten mythological poems of the ancients. Now, as far as I know, there's no English version of this, but this might very well be wrong. In any regard, I'm going to read from the German to you and translate as I go. This was published first in 1791, a genealogy of the gods, a retelling of the ancient gods, and it was an incredible success, but it is also, more importantly, really one of the foundations of the Romantics' relationship with the gods and forms part of this, I would say, until this day, not yet entirely complete return of the gods, which begins, believe it or not, with Immanuel Kant's destruction of Christian ontotheology and metaphysics. And so what I'd like to do, I'd like to just read a couple of the paragraphs of the first 2 pages to you to give you an idea what Moritz is after. And to give you an idea how he understands myths, mythology, and hence also how others in his time and after may very well have understood mythology: Hölderlin, Goethe, Schiller, Heidegger, etc. And before I begin, I'd like to invite you to enroll in one of our courses at the Halcyon Academy, maybe Kant, German idealism, Heidegger, etc. Just follow the link in the description of this video and start learning. So we begin with the following. Moritz places great emphasis on fantasy. And I would distinguish fantasy from the imagination, as does Moritz, as did Goethe as well. And when he considers fantasy is not so much a human faculty, but a moment, let's say, of the unfolding of spirit as such. So fantasy has its own realm, its own domain. Of course, we could say human beings have the faculty of fantasy, and we can fantasize about things, but fantasy, as it were, itself projects certain notions, images, etc. And we, human beings, are somewhat cast in between. And so are the gods, between that which fantasy brings forth. So let me begin. The first paragraph reads, and I'll translate these paragraphs as best I can, and then comment on them, what comes to mind. Mythological poems must be viewed as a language of fantasy. As such, or taken as such a language, that's the mythological poems, or mythological stories, they comprise a world of their own, and they are, therefore, also taken out of the context of actual or real things. So they are not immediately part of reality, as we might say, of everyday reality. They are of the realm of fantasy itself. Fantasy has its domain, or dominates, or reigns rather, in its own realm, according to its own will, or how it's pleasing to it. And in this realm, fantasy is free. There's nothing that, in that sense, are limited. So it doesn't have to follow, let's say, metaphysical rules or laws or any sort of argumentation that, let's say, laws of argumentation. It doesn't have to argue for anything. It is free in its own domain. So Moritz takes seriously fantasy. and how it reigns in its own domain. Its essence is to form, and that is a bit difficult because it says here, ihr Wesen ist zu formen und zu bilden. So we could say perhaps its essence is to form and not construct, but to make, to shape something, perhaps, to make a certain shape, or to shape something, to come up with certain gestalts, perhaps, that are of its own accord, that are again of fantasy as such. And for that, it generates for itself, that is fantasy, its own and a very broad Spielraum. I'll just be very literal here, its own space of play. So fantasy generates, again, it rules within its domain, but when fantasy begins to bring forth and form images, etc., what it does is it actually generates for itself a space of play. And that indicates, that if you want to use that kind of language, that quote unquote, it uses its own quote unquote laws, etc. Or rather, it is its own space. So, and as he continues, in which it, fantasy, avoids, and carefully so, all abstract and metaphysical concepts, which could hinder or impede or distort or disturb its formations, its creations. So I think this is crucial. Is what Moritz does here is I think he invites the readers of his time to abstract, in a sense, their own mind from metaphysical concepts and laws and abstractions, and rather allow for those myths to stand there in their own right. Fantasy avoids the concept, or actually is rather, you could almost say, is timid when it comes to the concept, or rather, let's say, wants to avoid the concept of a metaphysical infinity and indeterminateness, or limitlessness rather. And it does so the very most because it's rather, its creations are so frail that they might get lost as if in a desert. And suddenly so, if metaphysical infinity or limitlessness and limitlessness would be part in their concept of fantasy. So fantasy, this introduces a certain sense of limitation, of finitude, and actually, in fact, as you can see, I think, because what it brings forth, then in their own realm, they need to be cast into a certain, even if of their own accord, time and space. So it's never purely abstract. In some sense, what Moritz, I think, is implying here is that mythological fantasy is, in some sense, more concrete than metaphysical logical abstraction. And by implication, metaphysical limitlessness and metaphysical infinity is a desert, to use Moritz's own terminology here. Fantasy avoids, or flees rather, from a beginningless existence. Everything, according to fantasy, is genealogy or generation, is bringing forth, is birthing, even until all the way back to the oldest history of the gods. And there will be something very striking Moritz is about to say in just a few paragraphs on those oldest myths that we have inherited. And again, Moritz's writings form part of a recurrence of the gods, of which Hölderlin poetizes and which Heidegger continues, and so does Nietzsche, of course. And I also would like to point out, if you want to perhaps go a bit deeper here, there's a video on my channel on Schelling on the relationship between monotheism and polytheism, as Schelling sees it. That might be of interest here to those listening as well. And here's something striking. It's mentioned by Moritz. It was just, this is just three or four short paragraphs in, and we could already write entire books just on this. So none of those higher beings which fantasy portrays for itself or projects for itself is of eternity. None of them is of limitless power. Also, fantasy avoids the concept of all presence or omnipresence, which would impede or stifle the life and the movement of or within its Götterwelt, within its world of gods. So crucially, it is fantasy at the core that projects, creates, as it were, generates beings, higher beings such as gods and heroes, and sometimes, of course, also places, mythical places. But none of those beings, let's say the gods, are ever of just eternity. And none of them are of limitless power. So Jupiter or Zeus is limited by Hera or Juno insofar as she is jealous of him and his deeds and his many affairs. Now, we shouldn't read this in also a human or way, but instead should realize what this means, what the jealousy of Hera means towards Zeus. It means that even Zeus, as the father of the gods and the Olympians and of the human beings to a certain extent also, is not unlimited in his power. And that fantasy avoids the concept of all presence or Allgegenwart, omnipresence, I think is also crucial. And again, why? Because it would actually hinder or even stifle entirely the movement and the life of the gods. Or maybe not just of the gods, because how do we understand the word Götterwelt? The world of the gods perhaps could also mean something to the effect the world which we inhabit. The world of omniscience and omnipresence, the world of monotheism, isn't it ultimately paranoid? Isn't it ultimately one of control and this assumption of limitless power, of limitless insight into the deepest corners of your soul and who you really are, and what really all of this is about is if the entire plan had already been written and now all of this is just playing out in sort of a divine comedy. And I would say that even Dante, even though it seems that he writes a sort of Christian apology, is ultimately forms part of this esoteric battle against crude monotheism. Omnipresence would stifle life. I mean, if you think about it, isn't the end result, ultimately, or the end game even, of monotheism, atheism, of a godless world? There's so much talk about the disenchantment of the world and re-enchanting the world. The disenchanted world is born in Europe, out of Christianity. You can perhaps think about this for a second. It's not a loss of Christianity, it's Christianity that leads to this loss of the world of the gods. And at the same time, of course, with Kant, there's an invitation for the gods to return. Hence, fantasy, Moritz continues, searches as much as possible or seeks to rather, its formations and its creations to tie them to time and place. So while they are, to come back to the beginning, while they are taken out of the context of reality, they are also tied back to a concrete place. So this hero was born here, etc. And this demigod was born here, over there. So you that needs to happen because it avoids abstraction. So in some sense, what we learn here is that this mythologos is a most concrete logos. It's not a universalizing logos, but is one that is always temporal and always spatial, but at the same time, in its images, in its formations, isn't tied to what we might perceive as immediate reality. And what would harm her is, to paraphrase what he says here, is because she's of a dim light. I say she because in German, fantasy is die Fantasie, is female, but to be closer to be more correct in English, let's just say it. So fantasy is of a dim light, and it would take, and it might be harmed if it were to have too much bright light of reality upon her. And hence it looks for fantasy, it rather likes to lean on the dark history of the pre-world, of the ancient world, where time and place often themselves are still not precise, they're indeterminate. But you see, there is a time and a place, but those are not perfectly determined. So it's not chronological time, it's chirological time, if you like. It's the time of kairos. And hence, again, it has more Spielraum. Fantasy has more room to play. Jupiter, of course, who's the father of gods and men, is fed by a goat or goat's milk on the island Crete, and is also raised and reared by the nymphs of the forest. So we can see here how fantasy ties together time and place. Again, this isn't arbitrary though. So for Moritz, myths are not, in some sense, made up fairy tales of fancy. They're not mere allegory either. Nor should they just be used as allegories to describe reality, nor should they be tried, nor should one try to turn them into quote unquote true or correct history. There's a sort of recorded history and simply a failure to account for what was really going on, or nor should one just understand, for example, Jupiter as just a phenomenon of the climate, of weather, instead of the atmosphere, of the environment. Instead, there is, and this I think is the most striking paragraph, at least to me, in this introduction, when Moritz says the following: in mythological poems or stories, there is at the same time a secret or mysterious, eine geheime, a secret trace to the oldest, long lost history that lies hidden in it. And in this manner, they become more dignified. That's the stories of fantasy or these mythological poems or stories, because they are not just empty or vain dream image or mere play of fancy and wit that that flies up in the air, but instead because of their innermost interweaving with the oldest contexts and the oldest things, these stories receive a weight or gain a weight, a certain gravitas, whereby their dissolution into mere allegory is stopped or is made impossible. And now let's focus on what he says here. There's a secret trace to the oldest long-lost history. So what Moritz here implies is that there is a Geschichte, a story rather, not so much recorded history, but a history of, as I would refer to it, of memory itself, of which the mythological stories are remembrances, recollections of it. And it is the task, and this is also, I think, the task of this book, is to help us reconnect with this trace, to regain an understanding of who we are. The innermost interweaving, I think, is the most striking then also here, thing that he says. So while we shouldn't try and do the following, which is what's so prominent, isn't it? I mean, Joseph Campbell, for example, did this, and I would assume to some extent Jung as well, psychoanalytical, ultimately psychological readings of myths. You know, certain archetypes that are repeated in them, and you can read them into those stories. Or you could say these are allegories that tell us something else about life and how to live our lives, and these are stories of virtue, etc. But there is a certain veil, as Moritz says here, that can never be pulled away. If we did, we would actually destroy this very gentle fabric of fantasy. We would actually destroy fantasy itself, and that means the core of perhaps of memory itself, and to which the mythological poems and stories should lead us back, or could lead us back. So in some sense, writers like Jung and Campbell have not really helped matters, because what Campbell does is he makes it possible to use certain elements of myth and generate new stories, because these elements work in a certain sense, because yes, they do speak to human psychology, but they do so because human psychology is itself of that very trace to which we are connected, that leads back to the long lost Geschichte, to long lost memory, which we have to recover. And as you might know, Joseph Campbell was on I think on an advisory board, or was an advisor to George Lucas and others. So Moritz, in some sense, foresees all of this happening. Or at his time, of course, this is also already happening, that these stories are being read as mere allegory. Of course, he couldn't have foreseen how quite horrendous the psychologization, how far it would go. You can think of more recent commentators who did the very same thing. But what we have to take seriously is that there is something genuinely divine about these stories. There is something that we don't have access to, but that still speaks to us and addresses us and pulls us in, and that we have to try and retrieve, or at least find trace to it, because it's on this trace, if we are on it, this secret path, as it were, that we begin, I would say, to come back to our senses. We are ultimately what is the human being. The human being is living memory. And this book and a few others are such texts that could bring forth again an understanding, not just of the teaching of the gods, so that we find a center again. So thank you very much for listening. And also I'd like to invite you again to take a course at the Halcyon Academy, named so after the mythical ice bird that breeds in between tempest around winter solstice. Thank you.